Password entered.
Do you miss films like Blade Runner with their brooding, gun-toting, outcast protagonist and not so far off futures saturated with super advanced technologies, urban decay, power balances and oppression? You may have noticed that there aren't a lot of new movies like this, unless of course you count remakes of existing movies. It forces you to wonder, has the genre simply become old-fashioned? Has Hollywood moved on? Or is there some kind of deeper reasoning? Perhaps it has something to do with the idea that we're already living in the technological age described by cyberpunk writers of the past. Cyberpunk is the intersection between science fiction and postmodernism. It is a type of science fiction that deals with real-world technologies and near futures, setting them against a fantasy backdrop. It integrates technology and literature in a world where the gap between science fiction and reality is rapidly closing. These days, that gap is practically closed. Technology advances so quickly that we become complacent, unimpressed, and accepting of it. When these imagined technologies become real, they're no longer exciting or fantastical anymore. When everyday people have a better grasp and understanding of technology, it becomes harder and harder to make far-fetched stories seem believable. Bruce Sterling proclaims that cyberpunk is dead because it has become restrained, commercialized, and mimetic. According to him, the respected benchmarks of cyberpunk no longer offer spontaneous backflips and crazed dancing on tables, as the settings come closer and closer to the present day, losing their fantasy. In the age of Neuromancer, we could still believe for one charismatic moment that the body could deep dish its way past screenal telemetry into galactic flows of data presence. Johnny Mnemonic is a bitter reminder of the decline of cyberpunk into the present state of hyper-rational technology.
Jesus wept!
When cyberpunk science fiction first emerged, the mass media had little concept of the data-driven tech of the future. These days, we have a clearer idea of where our future is headed, already having tapped into artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and virtual reality. Perhaps the cyberpunk genre is disappearing because we have a greater grasp of cyberculture. Consider for a moment the idea of cyberpunk stories existing as a manifestation of man's fear. Technology is seen as good, but advanced sentient machines that can feel, think, and mimic human behavior and one day rise up and take control of society is bad. How on earth do we reach such conclusions? Because we fear change. We're naturally suspicious of advances, especially in science. We like our rules, regulations, and order. We don't relish disruption, yet science has always disrupted society. From Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to Lovecraftian horror, fiction has frequently been used as a means of representing and understanding fear. Cyberpunk is always set in a dystopic near future where technologies that exist at the time are being used in a way that threatens the survival of the world. Within the science fiction genre, cyberpunk concerns itself most directly with the implications of cyberspace, virtual reality, and a host of technologies that place real human forms at risk. The genre is embedded with worldly themes and issues that echo the fears of the authors as they seek to explain how they believe humans will interact with new technologies and ultimately abuse them. At its very core, cyberpunk is pessimistically explorative. For many cultural critics, cyberpunk has become the preeminent literary genre of the postmodern era, since it alone seems capable of understanding the rapid technological and cultural changes occurring in the late capitalist post-industrial society. In this post-postmodern era, have people become less fearful of cyber technology because it has become so prominent in our everyday lives? If this is the case, then could it be argued that stories of cyberpunk technologies destroying society as we know it don't make sense anymore? It brings forth so many questions. Are we more accepting of new technology? What kind of fears do we have regarding our current technologies? Do we still have this dystopian view of the future, or do we have more positive perceptions? Is there room for the cyberpunk genre to re-emerge in our modern culture? And if so, how might it be different? In order to answer these questions, I conducted an online survey of 80 participants of varying ages, demographics, and lifestyles. I asked them several key questions about their fears and opinions regarding many current and near-future technologies. I also asked them to express their level of concern over some important cyber-related issues. But before doing this, the current state of cyberpunk needed to be examined. Lawrence Person argues that we have entered the post-cyberpunk era, where works use the same immersive world-building techniques as classic cyberpunk, but feature different characters, settings, and most importantly, make fundamentally different assumptions about the future. Far from being alienated loners, post-cyberpunk characters are frequently integral members of society. They live in futures that are not necessarily dystopic, but their everyday lives are still impacted upon by rapid technological change and an omnipresent computerized infrastructure. Think about this in relevance to recent films such as Transcendence. This work plays upon current cyber fears and deals with issues of cyber technologies, but is not set in a dystopic world, and there still exists an underlying theme of hope and positivity. It is less cyberpunk and more techno-thriller. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, with works like Psychopass existing as an almost perfect example of cyberpunk, and several games such as Remember Me and Watch Dogs being very cyberpunk-esque in style and storyline. But the question remains, can they ever truly be works of cyberpunk or mere recreations of it? It is more than just a genre, but a movement and an ideology as well. It is therefore tied to a frame of time and place. I do believe, however, that there is a chance for the movement to re-emerge. But as Person pointed out, the key difference will be the change in assumptions made about the future. That's what I wanted to find out through my research. I wanted to know the difference in assumptions we make about technology today and what our current techno fears and future perceptions are. Here is where the results come in. The response to the first question was very surprising, with 35% of participants stating they had a negative perception of the future, in that they think we are headed towards disaster rather than utopia. This actually contradicts what I had hypothesized earlier, based on Person's argument. Where I thought there would be a positive trend in perceptions, the survey showed that majority had a bleak dystopic view reminiscent of classic cyberpunk. We must consider though that these perceptions are shaped by many other external factors other than cyberpunk technologies. And in fact, when asked what their perception of cyber technologies was, 50% said helpful and 24% said extremely helpful. There was only 6% who said they thought cyber technology was dangerous. This shows a vast difference towards positive perceptions and suggests a greater acceptance of technological advancement. When asked their level of fear over technological advancement, 50% said not very frightened and 11% said not frightened at all. There were only 3% that said they were frightened and 18% said they were moderately frightened. This again shows a greater acceptance of technology and a low level of cyber-related fear. This does not mean, however, that fear has been eradicated entirely. There were still areas of cyber culture that generated anxiety, predominantly in the field of artificial intelligence. When asked if there were any current or near future technologies they were worried about, the most common answer was artificial intelligence, and for a plethora of different reasons, ranging from AI's killing or enslaving us, to unemployment from AI's flooding the job market, and even the ethics of playing God. Others were concerned about their online privacy, online security, drone spying, government control through wearable technology, and social media dependency. One of the participants was concerned bio-cybernetic organ transplants would expand the human lifespan so much that the world would be destroyed through overpopulation. When asked what issues concern them the most, the three biggest worries were cyber terrorism, online privacy, and cybersecurity. One thing that stood out was in the qualitative response section, there was a lot of mentioning of films such as I, Robot and The Matrix to explain or justify answers. This to me implies people are basing their perceptions of cyber technologies on the films they have seen. This has forced me to reshape my thinking, and that maybe it is not people's fears that shape cyberpunk films, but rather films that shape people's cyber fears. This could add to the argument that cyberpunk can never re-emerge as a genre because we are past the point where any idea exploration is not already influenced by other similar works. In order to make a comeback, it would require some cutting-edge forward thinking into the future of technology beyond what has already been conceived. It is the same for the argument that we are already living in the technological age described by writers of the past. In order for the genre to come back, authors would need to recreate the whimsicalness and excitement of cyberpunk through predictions about non-existent and non-banal technologies. In terms of us being less fearful of technology, the survey showed that although we are generally more accepting of advancement, we still hold fears towards several cyber technologies and are concerned about a range of different cyber issues. On top of this, the survey showed we have a pessimistic view of the future. This means that perhaps the stories of cyberpunk technologies negatively affecting society as we know it still make sense and are relevant in today's times. Perhaps the cyberpunk genre is not dead after all.